Charlie Swan was, he was a great doctor. He was a great young fella, and we were really happy in practice together. But I have to tell you, I don't want to say he was pushy, but he was not afraid to push himself forward a little bit. So I guess he was a little bit pushy. But he happened, as soon as he graduated from Bowdoin, he went off to Boston, and he just happened to be there when the first administration of anesthesia with ether took place, and he witnessed that, and he took careful notes, and he watched it very carefully, and he wasn't the least bit afraid that he wouldn't know what to do just because he'd never done it before. He saw it done, and a day or two later he happened to be in New York at a hospital watching a procedure that was about to be done, and the doctor was lamenting the fact that he did have ether, but he didn't know how to use it, and neither did anybody else. Charlie said, well, I saw it yesterday, I know what to do, and he did it, and it worked. And so I was always grateful for that, for the fact that he did take that kind of initiative, because it certainly was helpful many times, yes, when people needed some sort of operation and it was painful, and we were able to ease that pain a little bit. So that was one thing that we did have at that particular time. Well, I began, of course, sometime in the late 1850s to begin to develop some shortness of breath, and I knew that I had some problem with my heart. Someone earlier asked what I died from, so I thought I'd better tell you that I did have a heart condition, and eventually, just before the close of the Civil War, is when I died in 1864. Now, we were talking about this little family plot, and we feel very fortunate because almost everyone in our family is right here with us together. In the center, the obelisk is for Cyrus Hamlin. Now, I'll tell you a little more about Cyrus Hamlin. Cyrus Hamlin was a very good doctor, and in fact, he also was a very good medical detective. And before he sold us the cottage, it was before, wasn't it? Yes, that was before we got here. Before he sold us the cottage, but it was the same year, I'm pretty sure, he was very interested in the problem that was taking place around the area. There were a lot of people who were exhibiting symptoms, and they were getting very sick, and many of them died. And he began to think, well, that there had to be some common cause. The symptoms were all the same, people were dying, and so there had to be something that these people were doing that would make this happen to so many people in the same way. And so after a lot of careful investigation, he discovered that there was a sugar product that was coming from Barbados, and after he analyzed who had bought this product and who hadn't bought this product, he discovered that all the people that were sick had this sugar product. And so he was able to determine that this one item was the reason that people were sick, so they stopped eating it. It came from Barbados, and when the disease went away, the sickness went away, but that wasn't quite enough. Cyrus wanted to know more, and Cyrus was not strong physically, and he had tuberculosis, and he had recovered from it, which was not common in those days, but he did recover from it, but he still had some weakness in his lungs, and every once in a while he needed to either rest or try to go to a warm place. So he decided, when he sold us the cottage, he wanted to go to Barbados, because he wanted to find out more about this difficulty. And he did go to Barbados, and he managed to discover that it was in the refining process, and they were using lead containers, and the lead was leaching into the sugar, and that was the cause of this illness. So he was able to stop that sort of thing from happening. After that, he came back home, and he didn't want to go back into practice at the time. He was interested in going off to Texas. So he and and Dr. Charles Swan's brother Jimmy got on a ship and they went off to Galveston. And unfortunately, he did not live too long in Galveston. He got yellow fever and died. But we do have this monument to him, and it says, and think it's because he was in Texas when he died. On the side it says, "Though a stranger in a strange land, the hand of kindness soothed his last hours." And we certainly hope that was true, that he had an easy passing, and that we couldn't be there, and we couldn't. There was no way. It happened very fast. Travel was slow. Had to go all the way around the horn to get to Texas. So, well, no, you didn't, did you? No, you didn't have to go that far. Texas isn't quite where I thought. I got to brush up on my geography here. Now, Vesta also had another brother besides Cyrus, and that was her brother Hannibal. And I'm sure you probably already know about Hannibal, because Hannibal was the vice president with Abraham Lincoln. So he was another one of Vesta's brothers, and he did come to visit us. And I do know that at your funeral he did attend. I was not there, but I know that Hannibal came to Calais and attended Vesta's funeral when the time came. So we were grateful for that. Now, in our family plot here are all of our children except for Walter, and we had 5 children in the cottage. We told people earlier that we didn't have any children before we got here, but we didn't know whether it was too cold in that cottage or during the winter, and I don't know, but suddenly we had 5 children. We know that. So we had 3 daughters and we had 2 sons, and one of our sons, Cyrus, is right here. He died as an infant. He was only 10 months old when we lost him. And then we had our daughter Agnes. Now Agnes married and had 3 children, and they continued to live in the family house in our homestead until they died. And we had another daughter, Anna, and Anna was a teacher. She taught at Calais Academy. She taught there for a number of years. And then we had our little daughter, Ellen, and we called her Nellie. And she was sort of a character and always a little mischievous and liked fun, loved to write in her diary. She wrote in that diary every single day. Probably some of you have found it and read it, I don't know, but it's probably still around. She never stopped writing in it. Well, Nellie did marry. She married a man named Joseph Coney, and he was from Eastport, and he was a Civil War hero, but he was lost at sea after the Civil War, not long, about probably only 2 or 3 years after the Civil War, and he worked for a steamship company, and the ship went down, and she lost him, and she was still a young woman, and she had terrible grief, didn't she? But and she came home and she lived in the cottage by herself for a little while. Then eventually she came into the big house again. And then our other boy, Frank, that was a very very hard thing for us. You know, the Civil War was a terrible time in the nation, and certainly a terrible time here in Calais. There were so many families that their sons went off to war, and so many of them didn't return. There were the Coy boys. There were 2 of them. They both were killed. It was Frank Barnard. Then there were the Hickey boys, and there was Mrs. Pike's brother, the green boy. I can't think. It might have been Daniel, but I've forgotten now just what his name was. But Frank died in a terrible battle at Mary's Heights, and he was 19 years old, and we never got over it. And I think probably the rest of my family might have thought that it might have been because of my heart problem, and I didn't live a great long time after that. But Frank, of course, is not here with us. It says on the stone that his grave is on the field where he fell in defense of his country, and that's where poor dear Frank is. And the others are over here on the other side, but we're all here together. Right. And it's a nice nice way for us to be throughout eternity. Well, I mentioned Hannibal Hamlin a minute ago, and I keep finding these things, and I found a letter the other day, and when I knew I was going to come here, and actually, Vesta wrote this letter. Would you like to read it?
Well, you know, I could get up, I think. I'll try to get up.
All right.
I could read that.
All right.
Yes. Yes. No, I won't. I'll do it as well as I can.
Go
You've
right
done
ahead.
so well.
Yes. She wrote this letter to her brother Hannibal when he was nominated to be the vice president. He hadn't been elected yet.
My dear brother, I have been thinking that it would be highly proper for me to write you a line on this uncommon occasion. But whether it should be one of congratulation or of condolence, it is not so easy to decide. Do you remember old Pat Carey that used to live in Paris when we were children? And the story he used to tell of having his fortune told when he was a young man? That in his old age he was to ride in his carriage on the doors of which was to be the motto, "Who'd have thought it?" Now it seems to me if you should ever arrive to the honor of being vice president, the same motto would not be inappropriate. When I first heard of the nomination, I could not believe it. It took me so by surprise. But when I heard bells ringing, guns firing, and men shouting, I took it for a fact. It is common to hear people complain of the ingratitude of the world for services rendered, but it will hardly apply to you, for what Shakespeare says about there being a tide in the affairs of man seems to be fulfilled in you. You shall have my best wishes for your success and a vote if I had one.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure to get up.
Good. Yes, I'm sure. You've been
Yes,
sitting there for a
I
long
have.
time. Well, we're very happy that you were able to come and be with us today. And we hope that when you move on to Dr. Miner and you hear about how he started the hospital, that you'll think a little bit about how different medicine in Calais was for us back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s when we were here. And we thank you very much for coming. And now you will go on to visit Dr. Miner.